Okay, let's start out by looking at profitability ratios. And we're going to, of course, use our financial statement here for Saxton Company. Here we're presented with the first three ratios of the 13 that we've mentioned. The first three of these ratios, profit margin, return on assets, and return on equity. Now, in a sense, these ratios build on one another. Profit margin, this first item right here, you'll notice that net income to sales, or profit margin, is going to be used in calculation of return on assets. So in a sense, we start out profit margin as a return on sales. The return on assets then is a return on the total assets that we can break down into profit margin and asset turnover. And finally, return on equity uses this return on assets number in calculating return on equity. So we're going to build through these three ratios from profit margin to return on assets to return on equity. You do a little cleanup. Okay, for the first one, our profit margin. Profit margin is net sales, or net income rather, divided by sales, and the net income from the income statement was $200,000, and the sales from also from the income statement, the top line of the income statement, was $4 million. So our profit margin for Saxton Company is 5%. For comparison purposes, we also have an industry average. The industry average profit margin is 6.7%. So we're able to say from this ratio analysis that Saxton Company does not earn as much profit per dollar of sales volume as other firms in the industry do on average. Return on assets is defined here as net income divided by total assets. And net income, again, is taken from the income statement, and total assets is taken from the balance sheet, total assets on the balance sheet. Having said that, we can decompose return on assets into the profit margin right here multiplied by a term asset turnover that we'll discuss shortly when we talk about asset utilization. The profit margin was 5%, and we'll see shortly that our asset turnover ratio is 2.5. We get to the same number because, of course, sales cancel out and we have net income divided by total assets. So this is just a decomposition where we can see where the return on assets is coming from. Is it coming from more profitable sales, or is it coming from more sales per dollar of assets? Finally, our third ratio that we're interested in here is our return on equity. Return on equity is net income divided by stockholders' equity. Net income comes from the income statement, stockholders' equity from the balance sheet. Having said that, we can alternatively calculate return on equity as the return on assets, and then the denominator here essentially captures how much debt there is in the capital structure. If we earn a lot of money on assets, or if we earn a small return on assets, but we're very, very heavily levered, we have a lot of debt in the capital structure, the return on equity might be fairly high. So debt leverages the firm. That's the term that we use, leverages the firm, so that the return on assets, the return on equity becomes a higher number than the return on assets, assuming that the return is positive. The return on equity was $200,000. The net income was $200,000. The stockholders' equity was $1 million. That gave us a return on equity of 20%, which it turns out is greater than the return on equity of in the industry average, which was only 15%. So we see here that in our quick analysis that the firm earns less per dollar of sales than the industry average. Having said that, per dollar of assets, the firm, we compare per dollar of assets here, the firm is earning slightly more on each dollar of assets, which suggests that the firm is selling more per dollar of assets than the industry does on average. So our sales are less profitable than the industry, but we have more of them per dollar for firms of our size. Likewise, we appear to be slightly more leveraged. In fact, we can see right here our debt to total assets, I'll do this in red at the bottom, our debt to total assets is higher than the industry's debt to total assets. We're using more debt than most firms in the industry, or than the average firm in the industry, with the net result that return on equity for our firm is 5 percentage points higher than return on equity for other firms in the industry. The DuPont system was, or the DuPont company, was a forerunner in developing financial analysis for analyzing potential acquisitions and for improving management, financial management of subsidiaries within the company. Let's take a look at the DuPont system of analysis in the context of the Saxton company that we are looking at right now. Essentially, what the DuPont analysis does is notes that a satisfactory return on assets can be derived in one of two ways, either by high profit margin or by a high turnover of assets. So a high asset turnover ratio. In other words, generating more sales per dollar of assets. It's also possible that a high return on assets can be derived because both of those are high. And this return on assets is essentially line, or this little equation at the bottom, return on assets equal to profit margin times asset turnover, is just the same equation that we had back here on this slide. So return on assets equals profit margin times asset turnover. The DuPont system also notes that return on equity can be derived, a high return on equity can be derived through either a high return on total assets or through more generous use of debt. It's also possible that you can have high return on assets and high debt levels, both of which would increase return on equity. So our return on equity equals return on assets divided by this term 1 minus debt over assets. This 1 minus debt over assets, it's worth noting that 1 minus debt over assets is the same thing as equity over assets. Okay, so this is the fraction of the total firm that's financed with debt. You subtract that from 1, you have the fraction of the total firm that's financed with equity. Let's look at a nice chart that sort of captures the whole DuPont analysis. These first two terms, net income and sales, are the elements of the profit margin calculation. Likewise, sales and total assets are the elements of asset turnover. If we multiply those two together, we get return on assets. So profit margin becomes return on assets when multiplied by asset turnover. Then, from our return on assets, we can translate return on assets into return on equity by dividing by the level of debt, or it's really the fraction of equity to assets, but by dividing by this term 1 minus debt over assets, which is dependent upon the total amount of debt and the total amount of assets that we have. So in the end, return on equity can come from a number of places. It can come from profit margin, it can come from asset turnover, it can come from debt level, from high debt levels.